Chapter 5, The Beginning of the War. Shortly before midnight on the 12th of March, 1896, the Sirdar received instructions from Lord Cromer authorizing an expedition into the Dongola province, and directing him to occupy Okosho. The next morning the news was published in the Times, ostensibly as coming from its correspondent in Cairo, and the Egyptian cabinet was convened to give a formal assent by voting the decree. On the 14th the reserves were called out. On the 15th the Khedive reviewed the Cairo garrison, and at the termination of the parade Sir H. Kitchener informed him that the earliest battalions would start for the front that night. The Egyptian frontier force had always been kept in a condition of immediate readiness by the restless activity of the enemy. The beginning of the long-expected advance was hailed with delight by the British officers sweltering at Wadi Halfa and Saras. On Sunday, the 15th of March, 3 days after the Sirdar had received his orders, and before the first reinforcements had started from Cairo, Colonel Hunter, who commanded on the frontier, formed a small column of all arms to seize and hold Okosho. At dawn on the 18th the column started, and the actual invasion of the territory, which for 10 years had been abandoned to the dervishes, began. The route lay through a wild and rocky country, the debatable ground, desolated by years of war, and the troops straggled into a long procession, and had several times for more than an hour to move in single file over passes, and through narrow defiles strewn with the innumerable boulders from which the belly of stones has derived its name. The right of their line of march was protected by the Nile, and although it was occasionally necessary to leave the bank, to avoid difficult ground, the column camped each night by the river. The cavalry and the camel corps searched the country to the south and east, for it was expected that the dervishes would resist the advance. Creeping along the bank, and prepared at a moment's notice to stand at bay at the water's edge, the small force proceeded on its way. Wadi Atira was reached on the 18th, Tanja on the 19th, and on the 20th the column marched into Okosho. The huts of the mud village were crumbling back into the desert sand. The old British fort and a number of storehouses, relics of the Gordon Relief Expedition, were in ruins. The railway from Saras had been pulled to pieces. Most of the sleepers had disappeared, but the rails lay scattered along the track. All was deserted, yet one grim object proclaimed the dervish occupation. Beyond the old station, and near the river, a single rail had been fixed nearly upright in the ground. From one of the holes for the fishplate bolts there dangled a rotten cord, and on the sand beneath this improvised yet apparently effective gallows lay a human skull and bones, quite white and beautifully polished by the action of sun and wind. Half a dozen friendly Arabs, who had taken refuge on the island below the cataract, were the only inhabitants of the district. The troops began to place themselves in a defensive position without delay. On the 22nd the cavalry and camel corps returned with the empty convoy to Saras to escort to the front a second and larger column, under the command of Major MacDonald, and consisting of the Exith and Exith Sudanese, one company of the 3rd Egyptians were dropped as a garrison at Ambigole Wells, and a heavy convoy of stores numbering 600 camels. Starting from Saras on the 24th, the column, after 4 days marching, arrived without accident or attack, and MacDonald assumed command of the whole advanced force. Okosho was now converted into a strong entrenched camp, in which an advanced base was formed. Its garrison of 3 battalions, a battery, and the mounted troops, drew their supplies by camel transport from Saras. The country to the south and east was continually patrolled, to guard against a turning movement, and the communications were further strengthened by the establishment of fortified posts at Semna, Wadi Atira, and Tanja. The friendly Arab tribes Bedouin, Kababish, and Fogger arranged still more widely in the deserts and occupied the scattered wells. All this time the dervishes watched supinely from their position at Fukit, and although they were within a single march of Okosho, they remained inactive, and made no attempt to disturb the operations. Meanwhile the concentration of the Egyptian army on the frontier was proceeding. The reservists obeyed the summons to the colors of their own free will and with gratifying promptness, instead of being tardily dragged from their homes in chains as in the days of Ismail. All the battalions of the army were brought up to war strength. 2 new battalions of reservists were formed, the 15th and 16th. The 15th was placed at Aswan and Korosko on the line of communications. The 16th was dispatched to Suakin to release the 2 battalions in garrison there for service on the Nile. The 1st Battalion of the North Staffordshire Regiment was moved up the river from Cairo to take the place of the Wadi Halfa garrison of 6 battalions, which had moved on to Saras and Okosho. A Maxim battery of 4 guns was formed from the machine gun sections of the Staffordshires and Connaught Rangers and hurried south. The 2nd, 4th, 5th, and 6th Egyptian battalions from Cairo were passed in a continual succession along the railway and river to the front. In all this busy and complicated movement of troops, the Egyptian War Office worked smoothly and clearly showed the ability with which it was organized. The line of communications from Cairo, the permanent base, to the advanced post at Okosho was 825 miles in length. But of this distance only the section lying south of Aswan could be considered as within the theatre of war. The ordinary broad-gauge railway ran from Cairo to Baliana, where a river base was established. From Baliana to Aswan reinforcements and supplies were forwarded by Messrs. Cook's fleet of steamers, by barges towed by small tugs, and by a number of native sailing craft. A stretch of 7 miles of railway avoids the first cataract, and joins Aswan and Shellal. Above Shellal a second flotilla of gunboats, steamers, barges, and Nile boats was collected to ply between Shellal and Halfa. The military railway ran from Halfa to Saras. South of Saras supplies were forwarded by camels. To meet the increased demands of transport, 4,500 camels were purchased in Egypt and forwarded in boats to Aswan, whence they marched via Korosko to the front. The British government had authorized the construction of the military railway to Okosho, and a special railway battalion was collected at Aswan, through which place sleepers and other material at once began to pass to Saras. The strategic railway construction will, however, form the subject of a later chapter, which I shall not anticipate. By the 1st of April, less than 3 weeks from the commencement of the advance, the whole line of communications had been organized and was working efficiently, although still crowded with the concentrating troops. As soon as the 16th Battalion of Reservists arrived at Suakin, the IXTH Sudanese were conveyed by transports to Kosia, and marched thence across the desert to Kinna. The distance was 120 miles, and the fact that in spite of 2 heavy thunderstorms, rare phenomena in Egypt, it was covered in 4 days, is a notable example of the marching powers of the black soldiers. It had been determined that the XTH Sudanese should follow at once, but circumstances occurred which detained them on the Red Sea littoral and must draw the attention of the reader thither. The aspect and history of the town and port of Suakin might afford a useful instance to a cynical politician. Most of the houses stand on a small barren island, which is connected with the mainland by a narrow causeway. At a distance the tall buildings of white coral, often 5 stories high, present an imposing appearance, and the prominent chimneys of the condensing machinery, for there is scarcely any fresh water seem to suggest manufacturing activity. But a nearer view reveals the melancholy squalor of the scene. A large part of the town is deserted. The narrow streets wind among tumbled-down and neglected houses. The quaintly carved projecting windows of the facades are boarded up. The soil exhales an odor of stagnation and decay. The atmosphere is rank with memories of waste and failure. The scenes that meet the eye intensify these impressions. The traveler who lands on Quarantine Island is first confronted with the debris of the projected Suakin Berber Railway. 2 or 3 locomotives that have neither felt the pressure of steam nor tasted oil for a decade lie rusting in the ruined workshops. Huge piles of railway material rot, unguarded and neglected, on the shore. Rolling stock of all kinds carriages, trucks, vans, and ballast wagons are strewn or heaped near the sheds. The Christian cemetery alone shows a decided progress, and the long lines of white crosses, which mark the graves of British soldiers and sailors who lost their lives in action or by disease during the various campaigns, no less than the large and newly enclosed areas to meet future demands, increase the depression of the visitor. The numerous graves of Greek traders, a study of whose epitaphs may conveniently refresh a classical education protest that the climate of the island is pestilential. The high loopholed walls declare that the desolate scrub of the mainland is inhabited only by fierce and valiant savages who love their liberty. For 11 years all trade had been practically stopped, and the only merchants remaining were those who carried on an illicit traffic with the Arabs or, with Eastern apathy, were content to wait for better days. Being utterly unproductive, Suakin had been wisely starved by the Egyptian government, and the gloom of the situation was matched by the poverty of its inhabitants. The island on which the town stands is joined to the mainland by a causeway, at the further end of which is an arched gateway of curious design called the Gate of the Sudan. Upon the mainland stands the crescent-shaped suburb of El Kaf. It comprises a few mean coral-built houses, a large area covered with mud huts inhabited by Arabs and fishermen, and all the barracks and military buildings. The whole is surrounded by a strong wall 1.5 miles long, 15 feet high, 6 feet thick, with a parapet pierced for musketry, and strengthened at intervals by bastions armed with Krupp guns. 3 strong detached posts complete the defences of Suakin. 10 miles to the northward, on the scene of Sir H. Kitchener's unfortunate enterprise, is the fort of Handub. Tambuk is 25 miles inland and among the hills. Situate upon a high rock, and consisting only of a store, a formidable blockhouse, and a lookout tower, this place is safe from any enemy unprovided with artillery. Both Handub and Tambuk were at the outset of the campaign provisioned for 4 months. The third post, Tokar Fort, lies 50 miles along the coast to the south. Its function is to deprive the Arabs of a base in the fertile delta of the Tokar River. The fort is strong, defended by artillery, and requires for its garrison an entire battalion of infantry. No description of Suakin would be complete without some allusion to the man to whom it owes its fame. Osman Digna had been for many years a most successful and enterprising Arab slave dealer. The attempted suppression of his trade by the Egyptian government drove him naturally into opposition. He joined in the revolt of the Mahdi, and by his influence roused the whole of the Hadendoa and other powerful tribes of the Red Sea shore. The rest is upon record. Year after year, at a horrid sacrifice of men and money, the imperial government and the old slaver fought like wolves over the dry bone of Suakin. Baker's Teb, El Teb, Tamai, Tofrek, Hashin, Handub, Jameza, Afafit, such were the fights of Osman Digna, and through all he passed unscathed. Often defeated, but never crushed, the wily Arab might justly boast to have run further and fought more than any emir in the dervish armies. It had scarcely seemed possible that the advance on Dormola could influence the situation around Kassala, yet the course of events encouraged the belief that the British diversion in favor of Italy had been effective, for at the end of March, as soon, that is to say, as the news of the occupation of Okosho reached him, Osman Digna separated himself from the army threatening Kassala, and marched with 300 cavalry, 70 cameri, and 2,500 foot towards his old base in the Tokar Delta. On the first rumor of his advance, the orders of the XTH Sudanese to move via Kosia and Kinna to the Nile were cancelled, and they remained in garrison at Tokar. At home, the War Office, touched in a tender spot, quivered apprehensively, and began forthwith to make plans to strengthen the Suakin garrison with powerful forces. The state of affairs in the eastern Sudan has always been turbulent. The authority of the governor of the Red Sea littoral was not at this time respected beyond the extreme range of the guns of Suakin. The Hadendoa and other tribes who lived under the walls of the town professed loyalty to the Egyptian government, not from any conviction that their rule was preferable to that of Osman Digna, but simply for the sake of a quiet life. As their distance from Suakin increased, the loyalty of the tribesmen became even less pronounced, and at a radius of 20 miles all the sheikhs oscillated alternately between Osman Digna and the Egyptian government, and tried to avoid open hostilities with either. Omar Tita, sheikh of the district round about Erkoit, found himself situated on this fringe of intriguing neutrality. Although he was known to have dealings with Osman, it was believed that if he had the power to choose he would side with the Egyptian government. In April, Omar Tita reported that Osman Digna was in the neighborhood of Erkoit with a small force, and that he, the faithful ally of the government, had on the 3rd of the month defeated him with a loss of 4 camels. He also said that if the Egyptian government would send up a force to fight Osman, he, the aforesaid ally, would keep him in play until it arrived. After a few days of hesitation and telegraphic communication with the Sirdar, Colonel Lloyd, the governor of Suakin, who was then in very bad health, decided that he had not enough troops to justify him in taking the risk of going up to Erkoit to fight Osman. Around Suakin, as along the Indian frontier, a battle was always procurable on the shortest notice. When a raid has taken place, the government may choose the scale of their reprisals. If they are poor, they will arrange a counter-raid by means of friendlies, and nothing more will be heard of the affair. If they are rich, they will mobilize 2 or 3 brigades, and make an expedition, or fight a pitched battle, so that another glory may be added to the annals of the British Army. In the present instance the Egyptian government were poor, and as the British government did not desire to profit by the opportunity, it was determined to have only a small-scale operation. The governor therefore arranged a plan for a demonstration at the foot of the hills near Khor Wintrai by means of combined movements from Suakin and Tokar. The garrison of Suakin consisted of the 1st and half the 5th Egyptian battalions, the 16th Egyptian reservists, who had just replaced the IXTH Sudanese, and were as yet hardly formed into a military body, 1 squadron of cavalry, 1 company of camel corps, and some detachments of artillery. The garrison of Tokar consisted of the XTH Sudanese and a few gunners. From these troops there was organized in the 2nd week in April, with all due ceremony, a Suakin field force. The plan of campaign was simple. Colonel Lloyd was to march out from Suakin and effect a junction with the Tokar column at Khor Wintrai, where the Erkoit road enters the hills. It was then hoped that Osman Digna would descend and fight a battle of the required dimensions in the open, after which, if victorious, the force would return to Suakin and Tokar. In order to make the Suakin column as mobile as possible, the whole force was mounted on camels, of which more than 1,000 were requisitioned, as well as 60 mules and 120 donkeys. 200 Arabs accompanied the column to hold these beasts when necessary. 6 days' forage and rations, 1 day's reserve of water, 200 rounds per man, and 100 shell per gun were carried. At 5 o'clock on the afternoon of Tuesday, the 14th of April, the troops paraded outside the walls of Suakin, and bivouacked in the open ready to march at daylight. The next morning the column, which numbered about 1,200 men of all arms, started. After marching for 4 or 5 hours in the direction of Khor Wintrai, the cavalry, who covered the advance, came in contact with the dervish scouts. The force thereupon assumed an oblong formation, the mixed Sudanese company and the 2 guns in front, 3 Egyptian companies on each flank, the Camel Corps company in the rear, and the transport in the center. The pace was slow, and, since few of the camels had ever been saddled or ridden, progress was often interrupted by their behavior, and by the broken and difficult nature of the country. Nevertheless, at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Teroy Wells, 8 miles from Khor Wintrai, were reached, and here, having marched 19 miles, Colonel Lloyd determined to halt. While the infantry were making the zeriba, the cavalry were sent on under Captain Fenwick, an infantry officer employed on the staff, to gain touch with the Tokar force, who were expected to have already reached the rendezvous. Apparently under the belief that Omar Tita and his Arabs would give timely notice of an attack, the cavalry seemed to have neglected many of the usual precautions, and in consequence, at about 5 o'clock, when approaching Corwintry, they found themselves suddenly confronted with a force of about 200 dervish horsemen supported by a large body of infantry. The squadron wheeled about with promptitude, and began to retire at a trot. The dervish horsemen immediately pursued. The result was that the Egyptians began a disorderly flight, at a gallop through the thick and treacherous scrub, and over broken, dangerous ground. 16 horses fell. Their riders were instantly speared by the pursuers. Rallying 38 troopers, Captain Fenwick seized a rocky hillock, and dismounting with the natural instinct of an infantry soldier, prepared to defend himself to the last. The remainder of the squadron continued their flight, and 32 troopers, under an Egyptian officer, whose horse is said to have bolted, arrived at the Teroy Zeriba with the news that their comrades had been destroyed, or had perhaps returned to Suakin, and that they themselves had been closely followed by the enemy. The news caused the gravest anxiety, which was not diminished when it was found that the bush around the Zeriba was being strongly occupied by dervish spearmen. 2 mounted men, who volunteered for the perilous duty, were sent to make their way through this savage cordon, and try to find either the remainder of the cavalry, or the Tokar column. Both were hunted down and killed. The rest of the force continued in hourly expectation of an attack.